There we go. Well, welcome everyone. I am Reverend Bob Moore. I'm Executive Director of the Coalition for Peace Action. And on behalf of the coalition, I want to welcome you to this annual membership renewal and new member welcome gathering. We are pleased that you are joining us. We have a truly outstanding speaker lined up, Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Many accolades over a long career. One of the most recent ones was the New York Times called him, I think just within the last month or so, the Dean of American Diplomats, and certainly that's a well-deserved title. So we're very much looking forward to that. But before we get to that, we'd like to give you an opportunity to contribute a membership, either as a renewal or as a new membership. And to do that, the Reverend Carol Haig will speak briefly. And if you would look in the chat box as she's speaking, you should see a link there for giving online, as well as a postal mailing address. Okay, so Reverend Haig.
Thank you, Bob. In 1984, Dr. Helen Caldicott, the Australian physician, made a powerful presentation at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly on the danger of nuclear annihilation. Her message propelled me into anti-nuclear activism. As the mother of 2 children, I could think of nothing more important for me to do than to help in some way to prevent nuclear holocaust. In the 38 years since the Coalition for Peace Action, since then, the coalition's older than that, the coalition under Bob's leadership has strived to limit U.S. nuclear capacity, to strengthen negotiation as the desired alternative, to reduce drones as a tactic of warfare, and to counteract violence and hatred in many, many spheres. It wasn't until February 24th, the Russian attack on Ukraine, that I again truly feared that military use of nuclear weapons was about to occur. I really am afraid that Putin, in his megalomania, is capable of using nuclear weapons. The coalition is needed now to live up to its founding charge, nuclear disarmament. I know no other group so prepared to mobilize the populace and to inspire leaders of the U.S. to prevent nuclear war. Each year, when I invite your financial support of the coalition, Carl and I make an additional gift to our quarterly support of the coalition, usually an extra $100. This year, we're doing it 5 times that much. I'm old-fashioned, I write checks. I invite you to become a member or renew your membership or pledge or increase your pledge to the coalition. Whatever you have given or plan to give, consider multiplying it by 2 or 5 or 10. A generous donor has agreed to offer a $2,000 match. Please, let's overwhelm the coalition with our generosity. Instructions are in the chat, as Bob mentioned. This year, my appeal to you is truly to save the earth from nuclear annihilation. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. That was heartfelt and I think very timely. And in fact, on very short notice, we've arranged for another Zoom next Sunday on this very topic of the danger of nuclear war in light of the Ukraine situation. And so I'll say a little bit more about that at the end, but it is a very real danger, and some of the top experts on this are going to be on next Sunday's webinar, including a Princeton University professor who led a team that did a simulation of how a nuclear war might get started in exactly this kind of situation. So we deeply appreciate that, Carol, and please do look in the chat box. I think all of you should be able to see that. It says it was to everybody. So take a look in the chat box, make your donation. If you want to do it online, that's great. If you prefer to postal mail it, the mailing address is there. Now it's my pleasure to ask our board chair, Irene Etkin-Goldman, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Carol, for your very moving invitation to offer. Thank you for that. Ambassador Pickering, it is my distinct and personal honor to introduce you today and to say a few words personally in a reminder to you from more than 30 years ago when I first sought out and met Ambassador Pickering, then the United States ambassador to Russia in Moscow in the 90s, while I was independently working on the defense of whistleblowers in Russia at the time and the protection of artists. He was warm, wise, accessible, and a trusted counselor for me during those years, someone I knew I could always call upon for honest, reliable advice then, as well as now. And it is a distinct honor. The title of the ambassador's conversation today will be Diplomacy, Our Best Tool to Solve Problems and Prevent War. How more timely can this be? As Bob mentioned, the New York Times recently referred to Ambassador Pickering as the Dean of American Diplomats, and Time magazine declared him the 5-star general of the diplomatic corps. Diplomatic career spanning 5 decades, he was U.S. ambassador to Russian Federation, India, Israel, El Salvador, Nigeria, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And from 89 to 92, he was ambassador and U.S. representative to the United Nations in New York. And his last assignment was with the State Department. Department of State was Undersecretary of State Political Affairs from 97 to 2000. An ambassador has a wonderful sense of humor, by the way, who said he's tried to retire at least 4 times. And I don't think he's ever retired, frankly. Ambassador, with great personal pleasure, we welcome you to the Coalition for Peace Action today.
Thank you, Ms. Goldman, for the very kind invitation, and thank you, Reverend Moore, for your very kind invitation to join you today and talk about diplomacy, something dear to my heart. Lest we get started on too serious a note, I was indeed grateful for the encomiums in your kind introduction, but I remember very well that I spent 2 years in Nigeria. And in Nigeria, English has its own special flavor. And the pronunciation of the word C-O-R-P-S in Nigeria is corpse.
Oh.
So I feel that I'm a general of some corpse here, but let us put that aside for further discussion. The role and place of diplomacy in the United States has always been particular and somewhat peculiar. We at times tend to greet it with enthusiasm when it produces successes, ignore it whenever it becomes a burden or when it takes too long a time. We are, by definition, rapid problem solvers as a country. And unfortunately, we have an affinity in our own outlook about conflict that puts a high priority and indeed a high political persuasive value on demonizing our enemies. Demonization of enemies is not unknown in other cultures and societies, but it does raise very seriously the question of, can I make contact with my enemy? Can I communicate with my enemy? Can I, over a period of time, find a way to peace with my enemy? A number of leaders in various countries around the globe have said over the course of recent history that you can't and don't make peace with your friends, you already have it. You have to make peace with your enemies. And the necessary total connection there is that you have to talk with them in order to make peace with them. And we are engaged in a struggle in the United States at the present time of unfortunately elevating the aggressive behavior of the Russians to a non-communication effort or level, which I hope we can all encourage our friends, representatives in Congress and others to think about before they adopt and adapt this particular set of ideas as the primary requisite for dealing with the aggression against Ukraine. I want to talk a little bit about Russia and a little bit about Ukraine. I want to talk a little bit about motivations on both sides that in one way or another may have gotten us to where we are. Perhaps some things that we have done that have contributed both pro and con to that particular result. And then spend a little more time, if I can, ways forward in the number of particular questions that are out there that in one way or another have to be resolved by diplomatic solutions if in fact we are going to end the conflict as rapidly as possible, preserve human life, and do everything we can, obviously, to reverse the present course of action. These are not easy, and they involve a host of approaches and a high level of U.S. and indeed allied and friendly involvement in making them happen. So first question, what motivates Putin and why are we here now with President Putin having taken the lead in putting us and the world and his own country, in my view, in a very difficult situation? There are a number of possible explanations for this. Mr. Putin, grown up in the Russian and previously Soviet intelligence establishment, is a master at deception and a master, obviously, of keeping people off balance and a master, obviously, of doing the unexpected at the inopportune or unruly time for whoever it is the action is taken against. All of these have come into play. If you were to ask me, what is the primary motivation of Mr. Putin under the present circumstances, you might be surprised that I would say it is the preservation of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin in office. Nothing more complicated, nothing too unsimple, if I can put it that way. But it is a critically difficult and complicated situation which has emerged over the years. A number of us noticed this as early as 2011 and 2012 in elections that were then held in Russia for the quite powerful lower house of the Russian parliament called the Duma. And on the night of the election, it was quite interesting that election results were not readily forthcoming until 3 o'clock in the morning, Moscow time. And it was quite clear that Mr. Putin and his then replacement as president, Mr. Medvedev, had huddled for a long period of time, obviously cooking, not soup, not stew, but election results that in one way or another managed to keep Mr. Putin's party in power in the Duma and as a result himself in office. It was also about that time when we began to see a shift in Russian policy. And that shift took Mr. Putin in several coherent, easily understood, if looked at carefully, directions, which I think have supported the conclusion that he wishes to stay in power and that the policy directions support that. So policy number one was the exposure of the Russian public to extreme form of Russian nationalism, revision, if you can call it that way, of things that over the period of Soviet history and Tsarist history were in one way or another used to mold, blend, and build support for the key leader in Russia from among the public at large. And so these were things talking about the past history of Russia and its greatness as a power, the Soviet Union's role, at least in Mr. Putin's vision, of being alongside the United States, one of the two greatest countries running the globe during the Cold War period, and the necessity, point number two, for Russia to work to establish both a new position for itself in global leadership alongside the United States and China, and secondly, to assure that that position was buttressed in both political security and economic terms by the creation of. So going back to Russia and Putin's motivations, I think that in addition to the ones that I've given you, he's been motivated by the idea that he has this new place in the world that belongs to him and his country, and that part of the effort to support that has been to divide Europe and the United States, something that he has achieved the opposite of with his attack against Ukraine, where perhaps it is true that NATO alliance has never been more strongly glued together than it is now, and where the European Union is following suit. The reasons Mr. Putin believes this is the case has been his long look at the U.S. and the competition that he believes is part of how the U.S. views Russia. And he takes as a primary example the expansion or enlargement of NATO beginning in 1993 and 1994, where because the East European countries that wanted to join NATO sought to do so to defend themselves against what they believed would be a Russian aggressive instinct against them based on the long Cold War occupation of their countries and territories. At the same time, there was clearly in the United States a sense that while we did not want to antagonize Russia at the time, and while we kept the door open, so to speak, for Russian membership in NATO, we also had an obligation to the newly liberated countries of Eastern Europe. Were they able to meet the requirements to join NATO to do so? And that's how this has evolved. Now, it's quite clear that not every state in Europe, East, Central, or West, belongs to NATO, and Ukraine is one of the states that does not. The Bush administration in 2008 promised both Ukraine and Georgia that they could be considered to come into NATO. Many, including yours truly, believe that was a serious mistake and raised again, as NATO enlargement had during the 90s and beyond, Russian concerns that somehow NATO was a device for surrounding Russia with extra regional and other military power, with the notion that somehow or other this would end up in a color revolution in Russia, some of the same kinds of revolutions that had split off Czechoslovakia as it was, Poland, Hungary, and other states from the Warsaw Pact in the early days of change at the end of communism. It's a complicated and difficult situation. When I was in Moscow in 1993 and 94, I gave my views to the State Department on NATO enlargement. Those have recently been published with the release of the highly confidential cable I wrote at the time. Nothing stays secret forever. And it was quite clear that if you read that cable over carefully, you will see that those of us who were representing the United States in Moscow had a deep sense that something like what occurred under Mr. Putin was likely to occur, even though we did not know in 1993 and 1994, Mr. Putin was going to be the next ruler of Russia, and that he would pursue this ultra-nationalist course of action. Mr. Putin has asserted, as part of his justification for the invasion of Ukraine, that somehow Ukraine has never been a country, something that I found a deep and sincere exaggeration, despite the fact that over an historical period of time of 300 years, Russia in one way or another dominated Ukraine and Ukrainian politics. I have a story that I think illustrates some of the reasons why we have such differences, and some of the reasons why both the United States and its citizens and Russia and Mr. Putin have failed to update the relationship as the changes were taking place under President Yeltsin and beyond. And the story is a simple one. I speak, as I am today, around the country and often have been asked to speak about Russia. And almost invariably, the third question, and this is long after the end of communism, begins with the statement that the Soviet Union has just done thus and so against the United States, as if, in fact, the Soviet Union were still alive, that communism was still flourishing, and that nothing had ever changed. Now, there is a Russian, more subtle but clear opposite number to this. And the Russian subtle opposite number is the fact that Russians have never dropped the communist-inspired propaganda that NATO is an implacable enemy of Russia, the purpose of which is to do in Russia in any way that it can, and therefore there is no Russian way, if I could put it this way, of either pleasing or opening up a positive relationship with Russia. And these particular series of events and differences lie against the backdrop of what it is that we are dealing with today. And I say this because while most of these differences are in the political sphere, some between Russia and Ukraine have also stemmed from other actions taken on both sides. About 10 years ago, the European Union, the economic unity of the European states, begun after the Second World War and expanded continuously until today, was speaking with the Ukraine about a relationship between Ukraine and the European Union. And at the same time, President Putin was organizing an economic association of a few states with whom he had good relations. There were not many, and sought to connect the Ukraine with that new economic organization. And so the Ukraine was being pulled and tugged. And during the course of that pulling and tugging, a pro-Russian prime minister or president of the Ukraine emerged, who dropped the conversations with the European Union and then began to speak with the Putin Association of Economic States, and then lost his seat and his control in Ukraine and ended up in Russia. And so that particular set of differences was one of those that characterized the relationship between Russia and Mr. Putin on the one hand, and Ukraine on the other, and he sought to develop further and exploit that. Out of that came both the infiltration of little green men, as we call them, members of the Russian military, often in uniforms that not distinguish the origin of that fighting force, if I can call it that way, in Crimea, a peninsula occupying the southern portion of the Ukraine, sticking out into the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And it was taken over by the Little Green Men and then united itself with Russia. The history of the Crimea is also complex and very difficult. Until 1954, the Crimea, under the Soviet Union as a single large country, had been part of the Russian Federation, the largest member state of the Soviet Union, one of 16. In 1954, Khrushchev, then Communist Secretary General and leader of Russia, gave Crimea to Ukraine. Crimea has a combination of population. It has Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers. It has a native population, so-called, of Crimean Tatars, who are people whose original descent is from the group of Genghis Khan in the early part of the first millennium of the Christian era that took over Russia for 400 years and ran it indirectly. That mixed population at the time of Mr. Putin's takeover was divided mainly between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. And Mr. Putin held a referendum. Again, no one is sure how free and fair it was, but it came out that Crimea voted in the Russian-run referendum, guess what, to attach itself to Russia. Subsequent to that, there were in the Russian-speaking areas of eastern Ukraine, north and east of the Crimea region, in two of the major administrative subdivisions called in Russian oblasts, separatist groups of Russian speakers who, perhaps motivated by encouragement from Moscow, it seems likely, separated themselves from Ukraine,
Just froze again.
Yes. So I think maybe our best way forward, I guess it was Ed, said that it's difficult to have both the phone and the video connection. So maybe we should ask Ambassador to just call in by the phone option and take away his, I don't know if he can hear us, but.
Or a simpler solution I've heard is to give up the visual, and then the stronger current will let us hear his audio.
Yes, if everybody could try that, there's a stop video option in the lower left. Now, quite a few have already done that, but let's try stopping our video and see if that helps.
I think it's his video that has to be stopped.
By
The ambassador who has to stop the video. A little better, Ambassador, not great. So we can't hear you.
Okay, I think he's trying to dial in, and so I think what we need to do is tell him that he has to disconnect
There
from
he
the
is.
video one. Danielle, let us know if he gets in by phone.
Oh, we see you back again, Ambassador. So unmute, see what happens.
Are you hearing me?
Not great.
Okay, I see his, I'm gonna go ahead. Yeah, good. We just admitted you, Ambassador, on the phone. Now, we're told that the phone won't work if you're also on video. So maybe you have to disconnect and we'll just hear your audio. Danielle, is that right? That he would have to totally disconnect from the first one, right? To come through on the phone, or that was you, Ed? Ed, do you know any more particulars?
His phone, I see his phone number, but I do not see a microphone, so I'm not sure if he connected with his audio for the phone.
Oh,
sorry.
I just remember, Bob,
He's muted.
there he is.
On here, he's muted. If he can unmute.
Okay, Ambassador, you have to
I've
unmute your.
unmuted now
Ah,
on the
oh, good.
telephone by
Yes.
using *6. So
Excellent.
you should hear me
Okay, now we
They
can
had
hear
me
you.
muted. Okay, that's great. And if it will be okay with you, I'll put the video on so that the audio by phone and the video
I
should be
don't
here.
know if they'll
That's
work
great.
together.
No, it's working.
Yeah, I think it should be.
Yeah, it's working. It's
Do
great.
you see him then?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, there you
Yes.
are. Yes, great. Go ahead then, Ambassador.
Okay, let me continue on. So we have gone through motivations on both sides. I'm not going to trace the course of the conflict, except to say several things that I think are important to conclude. The Russian forces enormously outweighed in things like modern military equipment, heavy artillery, tanks, engineering equipment, aircraft, what the Ukrainians had. Although the Ukrainians had been engaged in 8 years in fighting in eastern Ukraine, as I just recounted, and turned out to have better training and perhaps more people with combat experience than anyone expected. It's quite clear now, I believe, that most observers believed that Mr. Putin thought that his military in 3 or 4 days could actually accomplish a blitzkrieg invasion of Ukraine, perhaps even ending up at the western border. And many who watched that were clearly concerned that he would not stop at the western border. There is a country to the west of Ukraine called Moldova, which is not a member of NATO, and half of which, since the Cold War, has been occupied by a Russian military force and has in one way or another kept open its contacts with Russia and would be a likely rejoining were Putin to have had more success and moved himself in the West in a fashion that allowed him to take over Moldova. We haven't seen that yet, but I raise it because I think it's not possible permanently to exclude that factor, nor do we see it happening quickly. The second thing is the Ukrainians have seemingly fought very well and have mobilized their manpower in a military force, and that one can only admire the Ukrainians' willingness to stand up to this onslaught by what clearly looked like greater military power against them. Russian activities seem to have slowed from the very beginning. They seem to be vulnerable to interruption of their supply lines. They seemed not to have had great success in rapidly conquering the major cities of Ukraine. Only one so far, the city of Kherson, which is northwest of Crimea, has fallen altogether, and the others are engaged in a siege in one way or another, obviously quite bloody. And those of us who watched the early Russian slowdown were reminded of Russian approaches to their internal war in the 1990s and early 2000s against the breakaway Muslim majority region of Chechnya in the lower Caucasus on the outward border of Russia, and the use of artillery barrages and aerial attacks against the cities and towns of Chechnya as a way to effect Russian subduing of that particular area and its reincorporation back into Russian control. The Russians also appointed local Chechens who were supportive of Russia to be a kind of puppet government inside Chechnya, in order to do it. So one might expect further developments along those lines in the military action. But so far, the Ukrainians have pushed Russia into a position where it is very difficult for them to make major ground gains, at least at this time. From the very beginning of the conflict, perhaps on the 26th of February or so, a conversation began between Russians and Ukrainians in southern Poland along the border with northern Ukraine, in and around the town of Gomel. And that set of conversations began against the backdrop of Russia insisting that it would not talk with Ukraine diplomatically or otherwise until such time as the Ukrainian army fully surrendered. Within hours, certainly within 24 hours, that particular demand by Russia was dropped, and the Russians instead went to a multi-partite demand. They wanted a neutralization of Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine, no Ukrainian membership in NATO to be ratified by Ukraine, no what they call denazification of Ukraine, which seems incredible to many people since the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, is himself Jewish and has in one way or another become a world-renowned figure through his regular broadcasts to parliaments and the international community from Kyiv, where he's remaining to face the Russian siege and onslaught of his capital and his country. There is also a demand by the Russians that the two oblasts in eastern Ukraine that have declared their independence, at least partially in terms of their territory, over the last 8 years of fighting, should be recognized. It's not clear whether it is the 1/3 of the territory which Russia and its surrogates occupy now, or the whole former larger province subdivision of the two oblasts, one called Donetsk and the other called Lugansk, and collectively called the Donbass, Russian abbreviations for the Donetsk Basin. It was, and still is, potentially a large coal-producing area with a lot of industrialization. Russian demand was that Ukraine had to recognize the independence of these two areas and the attachment of Crimea to Russia as part of a workout, if I could put it this way, of any kind of a peaceful settlement of the end game as it goes ahead. The United States, as you all know, has taken a position that it is seeking to avoid a ground war in which we participate, or an aerial war in which we participate inside Ukraine against Russia, at least for the foreseeable future, believing that such a development would be an opening to a third world war in Europe, and quite possibly, mainly probably through accident, miscalculation, misperception, or badly misplaced thinking, to the potential for the use of weapons of mass destruction. Chemicals have been the ones most recently talked about. Biological weapons, possibly. The Russians, we know, have both and have large supplies of chemical weapons and have used those on occasion in a very targeted way, but certainly in a way that has advanced Russian interests. And God forbid, nuclear weapons. The Russians have a significant armory of tactical nuclear weapons, in part to defend their long frontier against China, where they don't have the manpower to oppose China. And so this remains, as Reverend Haig told us in her introduction, a dark cloud over this conflict and where it might go, and what one at least needed to think about and hopefully prepare for, if not for use, for whatever ways we could mobilize to see if that can be short-circuited and ended. The Russian position that I've outlined for you has not changed, but while the initial conversations focused, as they almost always do, on a ceasefire and then the establishment of humanitarian corridors, the latter has been only a partial success, and the former, nothing has been obtained in the form of any kind of ceasefire. I can imagine the Russian strategy is to avoid a ceasefire because it has its greatest leverage in any diplomatic negotiation with Ukraine and indeed with NATO by the placement of its armed forces inside Ukraine and by their continued movements in and around Ukraine to take cities and move to the west. Not that that is being accomplished with rapidity now, but it is not something that in one way or another it is safe to ignore or set aside. And over a period of time, were the Russians to go to what I call Chechen war-style tactics, they might make greater progress over a period of time. It's not sure. On the Ukrainian side, we know less about their position, but we do know that they very early wanted a ceasefire, which would suit their interests. There was no reason, in their view, why they should be attacked. There was every reason to believe, partly from the United States, partly from other countries in NATO, that Russia, through our receipt of intelligence about them and the willingness of President Biden to publish a great deal of it, was before February 24th poised to attack Ukraine and would do so. And the hope was, at least, that some of the embarrassment of revealing the truth about Russian intentions would slow down, if not stop the Russians entirely. That was not fully the case, although we don't know yet and may not how long the original interest in attacking Ukraine was delayed up until February 24th. But it is important to keep that in mind. Diplomacy, which I want to talk about next, is of course something of an art and something of a science. It is not, in my view, magic tricks at a theater. It is the ability of both sides to come to a realistic appreciation of the situation they face, to multiply and strengthen whatever leverage they can bring in the form of pressure and persuasion against the other side, and as well, without undoing their position or appeasing the other side, begin to advance things that it could accept as a way to end the conflict as part of the effort of building a kind of structure of conversations that could end in some sets of agreements, whether partial or by stages or in whole. This is in many ways something that has been obviously pursued for a long period of time by many states in terms of how and in what way to proceed. Let me end now by discussing in brief compass what might be both some of the pressures that we have or can bring further against the Russians on the one hand, and secondly, what might be some of the directions in which a peace settlement could emerge. The pressures, of course, have involved first and foremost a wide series of economic sanctions, some of them begun as long as 8 and more years ago as part of the Russian absorption of parts of eastern Ukraine and the Crimea, as efforts to try, in the context of those Russian military moves, to push the Russians in the direction of accepting to sit down not only and have talks, but to work toward agreement. So far, the Russians' capacity to resist these kinds of economic sanctions has been large. Nevertheless, the new economic sanctions put on by the Biden administration, particularly sanctions put on in the movement of Russian money through the international financial system, mainly denominated in dollars, but not exclusively so, and the general acceptance of that by a wide number of countries who would not be prepared to allow their banking systems to be used to move that money has made a major impact. The Russian ruble has gone down from a significant number to a penny a ruble right now. The Russian ability to provide investors with any return on their money is pretty low, if not at all. The second question is the cutoff of trade in sanctions and how and in what way that can be affected. And the U.S. has stopped buying Russian oil, and we have talked to the Europeans about their stopping to buy Russian oil. About 46% of Western Europe and Eastern and Central Europe oil and gas comes from Russia, so that there has to be a system for providing alternative supplies of oil and gas if, in fact, Russia is going to be cut out from sending theirs to those countries. And that's not something easy to gin up. We have significant amounts of oil that we can increase and are doing so, both to ship LNG and crude oil or refined product to Europe. We have started talking with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, other major world producers to see if we can increase the oil supply. The second and related question to that is, can we also, as we cut Russia off from receipts of oil, also bring down oil prices? The bigger the shortage of oil, the more valuable the individual barrel becomes. And so Russia, in effect, by invading Ukraine and driving up the price of oil, has been able to have a double effect in terms of benefits to itself. This is much harder. There are only a few ways to affect oil prices. One of those is obviously to seek to push a large volume of oil onto the international market, and ditto with natural gas. A second might be, and so far the U.S. has not jumped at this opportunity, to find a way to subsidize oil prices, at least for a temporary basis, to move the question of Putin's benefiting from oil shortages, which he has in one way or another helped to create, not become a permanent and disadvantageous factor on the negotiating scene. We know that in the past, as market forces have tended to drop the price of oil, Putin has struggled and has not diversified his economy in a significant way, and is still, in many ways, therefore, on the leverage front, part and parcel of what is happening in the oil patch. There are two other areas in general that I think are important in bringing pressure on Russia. One is isolation of Russia, and the vote in the UN General Assembly 8 days or so ago on a resolution on Ukraine, which could not be gotten through the Security Council because of Russia's veto, produced a very large number of positive votes for the resolution on the one hand, and some not insignificant number of abstentions, but only 4 or 5 countries supported Russia. And so there is a clear sense of Russian political isolation, not something that someone who has aspirations for being a leading world power can relish as a product of what they're trying to do to become a leading world power. I think that the final thing is the help that we all have been able to give to Ukraine. While there are no indications that there is any interest in the U.S. in sending American forces to Ukraine, we have provided significant amounts of military equipment, including first-line things like anti-tank and anti-armored missiles, handheld shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. There's a growing sense that NATO members who used to belong to the old Warsaw Pact and who bought Russian ground-based air defense equipment could use that as a way to begin to contend with Russian control of the skies over Ukraine. I have thought that the provision of Russian origin fighter aircraft offered by Poland, among others, to Ukraine could be resolved in a way that would perhaps allow Ukrainian pilots to pick up those airplanes in Poland near to the border and fly them to Ukraine rather than seeking to have some transfer take place with the U.S. involved through Germany. I think the U.S. would have to agree to replace those aircraft with modern American aircraft so that Polish capacity or other NATO states' capacity to defend themselves was not diminished by supporting Ukraine. But those kind of things, I think, could help. I think that the major factor is the failure to make progress, but this is one of the ones that I think at the moment is still most tentative, despite the fact that our TV and other public reporting from Ukraine is very positive about where this is going. I think we need to watch that space very, very carefully because it will be determining. On the other issues, let me just say briefly, other issues that need to be resolved. The most important ones are around Ukraine itself, and I've told you what the Russian position is. Certainly the Ukrainians would like the Russians out, period, of all of Ukraine, Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk. Whether that will happen or whether they will settle for something short of that remains a very uncertain prospect. There are some observers who believe that there is a Russian-speaking majority in Crimea, and if given the opportunity for an open, fair referendum, they might choose to stay with Russia. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't believe, however, that there is any Ukrainian interest in seeing the 2 eastern provinces ceded to Russia or recognize their independence. There has, however, been a long-standing agreement now, a number of years old, that the Ukrainians have said at the initial conclusion of that agreement, they would be prepared to consider some kind of increased autonomy for local government of those 2 administrative regions. Whether that can be worked out and whether it will provide a bridge, I do not know. I mentioned early that there are economic differences between Ukraine, a number within Ukraine about a relationship with either a Western economic organization or an Eastern one. Henry Kissinger has, for some time, said Ukraine ought to be a bridge country. If it's a bridge country economically, maybe it could have relations both with the EU in a limited way, and with the Putin economic plan. The Ukrainian economy was part of the Soviet Union, so pieces of it are still in one way or another attuned to trading with the Russian Federation and perhaps other parts of the former Soviet Union. And that might or might not make sense. It's up to the parties so far. We've seen little there. There have been many who've suggested that politically, Ukraine as a bridge country could adopt an approach much like Finland, which, as many of you know, historically was invaded by the Soviet Union before the Second World War. Finland fought heroically, lost a significant part of its territory in that war, but preserved its independence and has now built up its own military forces where they're quite significant. Or like Austria, which became a neutral state recognized by both East and West in the mid-1950s, and where the Austrians are not, I think, militarily in a position to defend themselves, but now have pretty much NATO surrounding them, with the exception of Switzerland. And so something along those lines might be politically and in security terms something that could be looked at for a peace settlement. The bigger issues are three or four. NATO membership for Ukraine. There are a number of NATO states, including both Germany and Hungary, which have not accepted that Ukraine should be a member of NATO. To become a member of NATO, you have to obviously be willing to do so. You have to meet NATO's requirements, including having no border disputes on your territory, and that all NATO members must vote for your inclusion. And so it doesn't look as if a vote for the inclusion of Ukraine is anywhere near the horizon, and President Zelensky has pretty much dismissed Ukraine's interest in joining NATO to the long-term future rather than something immediate. The second question is there a way to begin a process of limiting conventional forces between East and West, particularly along the dividing lines, that will provide some sense of security without putting those particular borders in great danger. Some years ago, there was a Conventional Forces in Europe treaty, now since discarded, but it had within it some of the elements that might be adopted and adapted for an arms control basis for more security in that region. Connected with it, but different, is the placement of intermediate and medium-range missiles in the European area between the Urals and the Atlantic. That was in force until, in fact, the U.S. withdrew, saying that the Russians had developed missiles that violated the treaty. Many of the experts believe that an agreement could be reached that would, in one way or another, keep such missiles from being deployed, perhaps east of the Urals, where the Russians see them as a particular benefit in any confrontation it might have with China, and where the U.S. has seen that its air-based and sea-based missile capacities to deal with China in and around Korea and so on with Taiwan, should that become a problem, might be reinforced by more ground-based missiles, which are not limited in that region, and that would be something the U.S. would want to preserve. And then finally, the U.S. and Russia for many years have negotiated strategic arms control arrangements. Beginning of the Biden administration, a set of arrangements which was about to run out was continued in force. It has been suggested over the years that that particular set of arrangements was only a stage, and that a further build down in the number of deliverable nuclear weapons on both sides, including tactical nuclear weapons, quite probably could be the basis for another agreement. And at the Geneva summit last year, President Putin and President Biden agreed to continued strategic stability talks, which are supposed to be ongoing. I don't know at the moment with what life, but that's nevertheless out there as a possibility, and suggested by the Obama administration that the number of deliverable weapons be taken from an overall limit of 1,550 in the current arrangements down to 1,000 or 900 on each side. And so those are all possibilities that might accompany peace, might enhance peace, might be driven by the fact that the war at the moment is too uncomfortable for either side in terms of its proximity, both to nuclear weapons and their potential use. Thank you for the time to go over all of these things. My deep apologies for the various interruptions, and I now look forward to whatever you would like to do in the form of questions or comments or whatever.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickering. And yes, let's give a round of applause for that very thorough and in-depth overview of analyzing the diplomatic options. Yes, that was really quite good. Thank you so much. I do have 4 questions in the chat box that are all good questions. And so I'd like to go ahead and ask you to respond to those, Ambassador. The first one is, would you say the minimum needed for Ukraine to what would you say is the minimum needed for Ukraine to maintain its independence? Should there be a multilateral peace conference, and is neutrality a viable option?
I think that neutrality with the Finnish model, with significant capacity to produce its own defense, not full demilitarization, could be part of a concept for producing peace. There might be the potential there for other countries being able to say that they would support Ukraine in the future if attacked without any reason. And there might well be things like requirements that forces on both sides be configured away from Ukrainian borders, at least at this point, to provide for a reasonable basis for Ukraine believing that its own forces could provide the initial and hopefully successful first line of defense if it's ever attacked again. Can you get it? I don't know. The Russians have talked about demilitarization and neutralization, so the concept is not unknown to them. My own feeling is that insofar as an arrangement concerns Ukraine and Russia, those two should bear the primary responsibility for the negotiation. Ukraine should be able to count on full consultation with whoever it wishes, NATO states included, as it works its way through that particular set of activities. Where those activities go beyond Ukraine, Russia, then other countries have reason to participate because they will be asked to reduce, control, limit, and allow inspection of their forces under some of the arrangements I've discussed. And they will have to be at the table, or at least put it this way, they'll have to be enough at the table that they know what they're getting into, can meet their minimum desires for security and defense, and know that what's configured against them can meet those desires. And we obviously now have to be prepared for a situation where a major party like Russia, as it did with the famous Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia, along with the U.S., was committed to defend Ukraine should it have ever required that, didn't hold water.
Thank you. And here's a second question. Actually, there's a few more that have been submitted while you were talking, so we may need almost all of the time up until 3:30.
Sure.
John Bolton. John Bolton has dismissed his former employer's claim that were he still president, Putin would not have launched such a war. Bolton claims that former Guy wanted to pull out of NATO in a second term. Could the Europeans sustain a security alliance without the U.S. in it? And would they be taken seriously in Moscow if the U.S. were out?
I think the simple answer to that is no. The primary role of the United States in the alliance is to provide a very significant plus-up of European forces, both conventional and nuclear. And while France and Britain are both members of NATO and have independent deterrent capabilities, I'm not sure that either would consider their total capabilities together sufficient to deter the Russians in such a situation. And the Russians have, at least advertently or inadvertently, made themselves the standard for aggression in Europe, against which Britain and France would have to measure themselves were they to sustain a nuclear deterrent. And no one, not the Russians, not the U.S., not the British, not the French that I know of, wants to expand the number of nuclear weapon holding states in Europe or anywhere near Europe. And that was the reason why we have had over the years successful cooperation among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the 5 recognized nuclear powers, in creating the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the JCPOA, the Iran Limitation Treaty, and so on. And I think that hopefully that particular set of relationships still applies and is important to keep in mind.
Thank you. Here's another question. I just want to try to get through as many of them as we can before our time runs out. Is there any chance that President Biden would initiate dialogue with Putin?
I would hope so, and he has by phone. And one can wonder if, in fact, at some point, would Putin be interested in that? It would be an interesting indication that Putin's strategy would be shifting more to diplomatic end games than to military end games. And I think that over time, it's been clear to many observers, close observers of President Putin, and I agree with him that President Putin believes that President Biden is the appropriate opposite number and the person that he has to make the deal with, and that because each side has what it holds, and what it holds is an important security arrangement for each, and seen as the other side both as a deterrent and as a threat, then how and in what way to resolve those differences is very significant. The U.S. would be careful not to wish to tread on the toes of Ukraine on this, and would have to be very cautious and careful. But it is true that as a process goes ahead, how the U.S. could help to reorganize European security should have very much in mind how and in what way the European states get involved. And so the configuration of conferences, if you like, and the number of conferences that may have to be held and articulated, and the way in which they might be serialized all at once in separate rooms, seriatim, one right after the other. And the fact that they're all interrelated means that all at once gives you more flexibility to interrelate. But but it gives you a greater problem in terms of management and control of all of the moving parts that go ahead in dealing with them. I think that we should be thinking very carefully about that and how we would do it, but some balance between too many moving parts and too little activity has to be pretty much where I think the wise answer would come.
Thank you. Here's another question. Is there a way Ukraine is or can resist non-violently? Is there a way we can protect Ukraine without giving weapons?
I wish I could tell you I thought it was the case. I had the absolute pleasure and some of the pain 2 nights ago of seeing the movie Gandhi over again. One can only admire his thesis of satyagraha and the approach to nonviolence, the major motivating factor. And to some extent, perhaps, if Mr. Putin were the King of England or the Prime Minister, that might have more to go with it, but he is not. On the other hand, I cannot help but believe that it would be the height of irrationality on the part of Mr. Putin to go beyond where he is now gone, which is already too far in his threatening of military use of nuclear weapons.
All right, thank you. Here's a question about the no-fly zone. How worried are you about that with its resulting potential for potential direct conflict between the U.S. and Russian forces?
Great question, and thank you. All your questions have been good. I would say this, that I do not wish to see the no-fly zone take us quite rapidly and directly into a one-on-one, mano-a-mano confrontation with the Russians militarily. And militarily, to protect Ukraine as a no-fly zone, we would be required to take out Russian long-range ground-based missile systems located inside Russian territory, and perhaps Russian aircraft based on Russian fields that might in one way or another endanger any country, were it the United States, Poland, Germany, or anyone else who wish to dominate the airspace over Ukraine or keep anyone else from dominating it. I do see a substitute, however, and the substitute is that if there is ready to hand, and I don't know this for a fact, significant amount of ground-based long-distance anti-aircraft missile defense capability in the hands of NATO, we should consider very much having that move to Ukraine and trading up U.S. military equipment if we can do it, as well as some of the Russian origin fighter aircraft if the NATO countries are willing to trade them against replenishment by the U.S. Now, I don't know how many spare airplanes we have hanging around or would want to give up, and how long it would take us to produce the number, and how that gap could be filled. And I do not know, I know that the press has reported Slovakia has the Russian S-300 anti-aircraft missile system, but I don't know how many units it has and how useful that would be, and whether in a military sense that would be capable of creating a no-fly zone or half a no-fly zone or a quarter or whatever, and whether it's worth the risk of taking that on. But others have suggested it. I thought those were perhaps useful ideas, and they did not get us, as I saw it, in direct confrontation with the Russians, either over Ukraine or Russia, in a way that might launch us into a kind of World War III scenario.
Thank you. What do you think about having free and fair referendum elections in the Crimea and the Donbass to see if citizens there would like to join Russia or stay in Ukraine?
I think it's a good idea. Advocated it in the past. My sense
Right.
is that Russia doesn't trust, quote, free and fair elections. Although the UN has had a great deal of experience conducting them, and perhaps is the best informed and the most able to provide what is necessary on the ground. But will the Russians not interfere? They have forces on the ground. They're unlikely to remove them, although one could hope there would be a ceasefire and a standstill that could allow that to happen. It's not beyond the mind of man. But at the moment, I don't see the leverage is built up sufficiently to push the Russians in that direction. And the Russians would have to calculate themselves. Do they still have a preponderance of influence in Crimea? Is that also true in the Donbass? And I don't know the answer to those questions. To some extent, Russia has been its own worst enemy in building popular support by launching a war. But there are people, obviously, who are sympathetic to Russian outlooks and views and who joined rallies in Moscow and are demonstrating in the streets in the other direction, as many Russians are demonstrating against this. Essential here, I think, for the credibility of anyone's role in the international system, ours included, would be to sign and carry out those elections not in a way that in any way prejudice the outcome, and be prepared to accept them. But self-determination is a principle of international law and is very important in this particular issue, but so is non-intervention in the internal affairs of states. That's already been broken. Can one help us remedy the other?
Yes. Here's another one. It was striking that even while former President Trump did many things that advanced Putin's claims, he also turned his back on arms control during his time in office. Any comment?
Well, if you believe that President Putin wanted to turn his back on arms control, then you have misread the posture he took about the extension of the New START treaty at the beginning of the Biden administration and the direct opposition he had to Mr. Trump in that particular area. He also, I think, blamed us for pulling out of the ballistic missile defense treaty as undermining deterrence and security. I don't particularly admire President Putin's latest actions, but I agree that he has points that were important there and that we shouldn't have done it. And I think that the shredding or tearing up of a whole structure of arms control arrangements, which were designed to build stability and prevent accident, miscalculation, and misperception from taking us into a nuclear conflict, were very important to us and to our continuation as a country and to our avoidance of mass casualties and planetary damage and all the other things that I think inevitably would come out of a nuclear conflict. And totally agreed that such a war should never be, can't be won, should never be fought.
Thank you. Another one, should the U.S. re-enter most or all of the nuclear agreements that it has pulled out of?
I think that doing that is tough, but my feeling is, and I said this earlier, we should, I think, as long as we don't have wide-scale deployment of intermediate range missiles in Europe, do what we can to deal with those. I don't have objections to going into the ABM treaty. I've watched this for years. I worked for a company that had a major role in producing parts of the ABM system, the Boeing company. But my own feeling is we have not attained the capability to have a very significant effect yet on incoming missiles, and that part of the ABM treaty was not to allow the defense systems to overturn the balance that was inherent in the deterrent system that we had built, and that it makes some significant sense not to do that. There may be better ways to handle that, including building down. I've often thought that people who have advocated zero nuclear weapons should be listened to. And I think that it's a very hard thing to assure, but it is not, in my view, impossible. That it has a very real requirement for the most careful kind of thinking, for the best kind of inspection and monitoring. The New START agreement took that a long way ahead. It may not be perfect yet there, but that there are things one can do as well. Now, the Russians have gotten very nervous about long-range conventional strike capability undoing the nuclear deterrence system. On the other hand, if both of us had it, and we're not reliant on the nuclear deterrence system, and we had an inspection and monitoring system that would give us high confidence the other side wasn't breaking the restrictions, that would be helpful. What Mr. Putin has just done does not add to people's confidence that that's a direction in which we can move quickly. We need more careful thought. But I think continuing to build down is significant and important. We have now something like 5,000 reserve nuclear weapons on both sides. It includes dismantled weapons or dismantling weapons, weapons under dismantlement, as well as reserve weapons for contingencies. But I think some or all of those could go over time, and that would make some sense. I don't think the miraculous will happen overnight, but the value of diplomacy is that it turns challenges into opportunities. And there are some huge challenges here that aren't easily turned into opportunities, but we should not give up. I always thought, and have for years, and I dealt with nuclear disarmament beginning many years ago, that if there was 0.25% chance of nuclear use, you were in danger.
Yep.
That kind of minor, put it this way, percentage was still very significant to avoid.
Absolutely. And I do like to run a tight ship. We're just a shade past 3:30 now. Ambassador, I do have a few announcements at the end, but let's give Ambassador Pickering another round of applause. That was an outstanding presentation despite the technical glitches, and really outstanding job of handling the questions. We couldn't get to quite all of them. Now, Ambassador Pickering, the issue you raised at the very end there, that even if there's 0.25% chance, this is something that we need to get a handle on and get it down to 0% chance, which of course would mean moving ultimately toward a world without nuclear weapons, which is our founding goal, the global abolition of nuclear weapons. So this issue has actually taken a big turn for the worse, as you know, because of Putin saying he's put his nuclear forces on high alert. He's rattling the nuclear saber about various situations. I applaud President Biden for not responding in kind, although I would very much hope that President Biden might declare a no first use policy and challenge the other nuclear policies, weapon states to do so as well, including Russia. It would make us a lot safer, but we do have another webinar coming up 1 week from today. We usually don't like to do them that close, but this opportunity came up on short notice, partly in response to a long article in the New York Times about the nuclear danger in Ukraine. It's way definitely not zero, and it's probably a little bit above 0.25%. It's definitely a real possibility and a real danger. So we have a world-class Princeton University physicist who will be joining us at this same time next Sunday, 2 to 3:30. And his name is Dr. Zia Mian. And his team actually did a couple of simulations about what would be the risk of drifting into a nuclear war out of exactly this kind of situation where a skirmish, some kind of military encounter had started. In this case, a pretty horrible war is going on, but so far with conventional weapons only. And so they came to a conclusion that there was about a 50% chance that it could go nuclear. And so this is really scary. Their simulation came up with that. And he's going to be with us to talk about that. His name is Dr. Zia Mian. Again, world class. The overall title of the webinar is going to be Russia's War Against Ukraine, escalation to nuclear war, or de-escalation, demilitarization, and disarmament, ? I think it's going to be a really important webinar. Many people have told us that this danger is on their minds in terms of this situation. In addition to Dr. Mian, we're also going to have Ray Atchison, who we've had speak for us a number of times before. She's with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, very strongly connected to groups all over the world. So I hope you will mark your calendar and watch for that. It's not yet even on our website. We just confirmed it late yesterday. So do watch for that. And finally, our Pennsylvania director, Ed Aguilar, is giving a talk this Tuesday night for a nonviolence group based in Massachusetts. And so that's all that is on our website, and you can join virtually. So take a look at that, and I encourage you. Ed is a very knowledgeable person on these issues, and I think you would find it worthwhile. That's 7 o'clock this Tuesday night. So we have a busy period, but we're facing major challenges. So we're ramping up, and we do need your support in that, both in terms of attending and your financial support. So again, remember, if you haven't yet contributed your 2022 membership, this would be an important time to do so. Again, thank you all for attending. Special thanks for Ambassador Pickering. I think he may have already gotten off. He didn't necessarily need to hear the announcements. Oh, there you are. You were all the way down in the corner of my screen. Thank you again, Ambassador Pickering. I think this was an excellent gathering despite the technical glitches. Thanks again to everybody for joining, and we'll see you again, hopefully either Tuesday night or Sunday afternoon. Bye-bye, everyone. You too.